Ancient ships crossed entire oceans without modern navigation or supplies. Their survival depended on a secret network of forgotten waystations, remote islands and coasts offering the two things sailors needed most: fresh water and dry firewood. By the end of this video, you will know the precise science and locations that powered global exploration for centuries. We will uncover how sailors found hidden water in volcanic rock and why some of these lifelines vanished from memory. What forgotten ingenuity from the past still surprises you today? Think about a ship's hull groaning under the weight of its own ambition. Every inch of space was a precious commodity. While we often picture chests overflowing with treasure, the reality was far more mundane and far more critical. The true treasure was water. A single person needs at least 2 liters of fresh water a day just to survive, and a ship carried dozens, sometimes hundreds, of souls. Storing enough for a 3-month voyage was a physical impossibility. The math simply did not work. Water took up immense space, and it could turn foul, growing thick with algae after just a few weeks. Then there was firewood, the other essential currency of life at sea. It was needed to cook food, to purify water by boiling it, and for emergency repairs to the vessel itself. A snapped mast or a splintered hull required dry, seasoned timber, not the sodden logs you might find washed up on a beach. This was the brutal calculus of exploration. A ship setting sail was not just a vehicle, it was a fragile bubble of temporary self-sufficiency, desperately seeking its next breath of air from the land. This fundamental need gave rise to an entire unseen infrastructure, a global network of pit stops long before the first highway was ever built. These waystations were the secret fuel that powered the age of discovery, and their locations were guarded with the same seriousness as any map to a gold mine. One such vital harbor was the remote volcanic island of St. Helena. Rising from the vast emptiness of the South Atlantic, it was a perfect storm of geology and geography. The island's volcanic heart was its secret. Rainwater would seep deep into the porous rock, filtered for years through natural layers of basalt and ash before emerging in pristine springs. For sailors who had been drinking from slimy, contaminated casks for weeks, this water was not just a relief, it was a miracle. It tasted clean, and most importantly, it rarely carried the dysentery or typhoid that plagued other ports. The location of these springs was not left to chance. They were meticulously charted, their exact positions passed from captain to captain like state secrets. But the island's generosity did not end with water. St. Helena was covered in a unique forest of endemic trees, a seemingly endless supply of dry, seasoned firewood. Crews could fell enough timber in a single day to fuel their galley stoves for the remainder of the journey to the East Indies, or to make critical repairs to a storm-damaged ship. This bounty, however, was not a free-for-all. The very survival of the waystation depended on a delicate, enforced balance. Strict rules governed how much wood could be taken and from which areas, preventing deforestation. The springs were protected from pollution. This was not mere common sense. It was an early, brilliant form of resource management. The entire operation was a precise science, a contract between human need and natural limits, ensuring that this single dot of land in an immense ocean could remain a lifeline for generation after generation of ships. Yet this reliance on natural springs was just one solution in a much larger, more adaptable network. Far to the north, the Azores archipelago presented a different kind of challenge and a brilliant human-engineered answer. These lush volcanic islands sat directly in the path of the trade winds, a perfect midpoint for ships returning from the Americas or heading toward Europe. But here, the geology was different. The islands did not offer the same kind of filtered, artesian springs as St. Helena. Their gift was rain, and lots of it. Settlers could not simply rely on what the earth provided naturally. They had to become masters of capture. They engineered intricate networks of stone channels that crisscrossed hillsides, funneling every drop of rainfall into massive stone-lined cisterns. This was not a haphazard process. It required a deep understanding of hydrology, of slope and flow, to ensure that the precious water was not lost to runoff. The entire system was a testament to planning, designed to collect and store millions of liters for the fleets that would appear on the horizon. And just as with water, the Azores provided for a ship's need for firewood in a uniquely sustainable way. The islands were covered in dense laurisilva forests, a type of humid, subtropical woodland that possessed an incredible ability to regrow. This rapid regeneration meant that crews could harvest ample wood for their voyages without permanently damaging the ecosystem. The forest would simply heal itself by the time the next ship arrived. The Azores were not just a pit stop, they were a living lesson in adaptation, proving that the most successful waystations were those that cleverly harnessed their local environment, turning a specific regional advantage into a global lifeline. But some islands offered no surface water at all. Bermuda was one of these deceptive places, a lush green paradise surrounded by an endless blue ocean, yet with not a single river or lake to be found. For a thirsty crew, this was a special kind of torture. The secret to its survival was not on the land, but deep within it. The entire island is a porous block of limestone, a natural sponge that soaks up every drop of rain that falls. Over centuries, this filtered rainwater settles underground, forming vast, floating lenses of pristine fresh water that rest delicately atop the denser saltwater below. Finding this hidden treasure required a specific art. Sailors and settlers learned to dig simple wells, not just anywhere, but in precise locations where the freshwater lens was thickest and purest. They had to understand the island's karst topography, its unique geology full of sinkholes and caves, which acted as natural funnels. The margin for error was incredibly slim. Dig too deep, and your well would punch through that fragile interface, allowing saltwater to surge in and ruin the entire reservoir. This was a science of balance, a precise knowledge passed down through generations. And just as its water was hidden, Bermuda's other gift was in its forests. The island was covered in juniper trees, often called Bermuda cedar, which provided a perfect, rot-resistant timber for ship repairs. This wood was so dense and packed with energy that it burned hotter and longer than almost any other, making it premium fuel for long voyages. Bermuda stands as a powerful lesson in perception. The most vital resources are not always the ones you can see. They are the ones you must learn to listen for, to understand on a fundamental level, hidden just beneath a seemingly barren surface. The science of finding fresh water reached its most delicate form on the sun-scorched shores of the Cape Verde Islands. Positioned off the coast of West Africa, this archipelago was a strategic crossroads for ships crisscrossing the Atlantic, yet it presented explorers with a cruel paradox. From the deck of a ship, the islands appeared as barren, brown mountains rising from the sea, offering little hope of relief. Freshwater here was not a matter of finding a spring, but of outsmarting the ocean itself. The solution was a masterpiece of engineering born from pure observation, the tidal well. These were not simple holes in the ground. Builders carefully excavated deep pits close to the shoreline, where the porous volcanic rock allowed seawater to seep in and out with the rhythm of the tides. But they understood a critical, invisible truth. Fresh rainwater, being less dense than salt water, would often form a temporary lens that floated atop the invading sea within the coastal aquifer. The well was designed to carefully skim this fragile upper layer. Drawing water was a race against time, a precise operation that had to be completed between high tides before the saltwater once again corrupted the reservoir. It was a perfect, fleeting balance, a testament to a localized genius for turning a weakness into a strength. And just as the water supply was adapted to the harsh climate, so too was the fuel. The island's drought-resistant acacia and baobab trees became the lifeblood of the galley fires. Their wood was incredibly dense, packing immense energy, allowing it to burn hot and long with very little smoke. Every aspect of this waystation, from the hydrology of the wells to the botany of the trees, was a specialized response to a specific environmental challenge. The very existence of this bustling resupply point in such an arid landscape is a powerful reminder that survival often depends not on fighting nature, but on learning its subtle, hidden rules. Far to the north, where the Atlantic meets the Arctic, survival demanded a different kind of ingenuity. The island of Newfoundland became a crucial waystation, not for its hidden springs, but for its openly hostile, frozen bounty. Here, sailors harvested freshwater from mountains of ice. Gigantic icebergs, calved from the glaciers of Greenland, would drift south on the frigid currents. Crews in small boats would venture into these treacherous waters to saw off great chunks of this ancient, compressed ice. Hauled aboard and stored deep in the ship's hold, insulated by layers of sawdust and tarpaulin, this glacial ice became a slow-release freshwater supply. As it melted over the weeks, it provided clean, cold drinking water, while also chilling food stores in a primitive but effective form of refrigeration. This was not merely collecting water, it was capturing a season. It required a deep understanding of ocean currents and seasonal ice flows, turning a navigational hazard into a mobile, life-saving reservoir. And on land, the resource was just as abundant. Vast boreal forests of pine and spruce stretched to the horizon, offering timber that was straight-grained, resinous, and perfect for ship repairs. This wood burned hot and clean, making it premium fuel for the long, cold voyages ahead. The entire operation was a calculated risk, a dance with one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. By mastering the science of ice and the management of immense forests, this northern waystation did more than just resupply ships. It effectively unlocked the colder latitudes, proving that even the most unforgiving coasts could be integrated into the global network of exploration. The Canary Islands rose from the ocean as a geological marvel, a chain of volcanic peaks that formed the final stepping stone for ships launching into the vast unknown of the Americas. Here, sailors found a resource so effortless it felt like a reward from the earth itself, Artesian springs. Unlike the hand-dug wells of Bermuda or the tidal traps of Cape Verde, these springs burst from the ground under their own power. Water trapped deep within pressurized aquifers between layers of impermeable rock forced its way to the surface through natural fissures, creating constant, flowing streams. For a crew exhausted from weeks at sea, the sight of fresh water pouring forth without a single turn of a pump handle was nothing short of miraculous. This was liquid treasure delivered on tap. While the complex science of hydraulic pressure was not yet understood, the result was undeniable, a reliable, clean supply that could replenish an entire fleet in a matter of hours. This geological luck made the Canaries one of the most efficient and critical waystations in the entire network, but water was only half of the equation. The islands were also home to unique forests that provided the other essential lifeline, firewood. the strange umbrella-shaped dragon blood tree with its crimson sap and the tall Canary Island pine became fuel sources managed with remarkable foresight. The local communities did not treat these forests as a free resource for the taking. Instead, they established communal rules that dictated how much wood could be harvested and when. This was a shared responsibility, a system designed to prevent overexploitation and ensure that every ship, from the first to the last in a season, had access to the dry timber it needed. The Canaries stand as a perfect example of a waystation where natural fortune was matched by human wisdom, creating a resilient hub that powered centuries of transatlantic voyages. But while some waystations relied on volcanic rock or glacial ice, others were built by nature itself. In the sprawling, watery labyrinth of the Sundarbans, where the Ganges River meets the sea, survival depended on a living filter. This vast mangrove forest was a waystation for Indian Ocean traders, a place where the very trees could turn saltwater fresh. The secret was in the roots. Certain mangrove species perform a quiet miracle, using a complex reverse osmosis system in their root membranes to filter out up to 90% of the salt from the seawater they live in. Local communities who had lived in harmony with this ecosystem for generations taught sailors how to tap this resource. They showed them how to carefully cut a notch in a specific root, or how to collect the slightly salty sap that had already been partially filtered, and then use simple solar stills to evaporate the remaining moisture, leaving the salt behind. This was not a gushing spring. It was a slow, deliberate process of coaxing water from a tree, a testament to an intimate biological knowledge, and the mangroves offered a second, equally vital gift. Their wood was incredibly dense and twisted, saturated with natural salts that made it resistant to rot and insects. When used as firewood, it burned with a slow, intense heat that was far more efficient than ordinary timber. A small bundle of mangrove wood could keep a ship's galley fire burning for an entire day, but this bounty came with a strict warning. The locals taught the sailors the rules of the forest. You could not over-harvest the sap or the tree would die. You could only take fallen wood or select branches, never clear-cut a grove, because the mangrove's intricate root system was what held the entire coastline together against monsoons and erosion. This was waystation science at its most delicate, a profound understanding that the resource and the ecosystem were one and the same. The Sundarbans did not just supply ships. It demonstrated that the most advanced resupply technology sometimes wasn't a cistern or a well, but a deep, inherited wisdom written in the roots of a tree. The mangroves of the Sundarbans proved that life itself could be a filter, but in the stark deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, survival demanded a different kind of brilliance. Here, ports like Muscat and Aden rose from the coastline not in spite of the arid emptiness behind them, but because of a hidden water highway that defied it. These were not just trading hubs, they were engineering marvels sustained by the Falaj. This was a network of gravity-fed irrigation channels, a masterpiece of civil engineering that turned the desert's edge into a bustling oasis for ships from across the Indian Ocean. The system was a triumph of precise hydrology. Builders would tap into aquifers deep in the distant inland mountains, where rainfall was slightly more abundant. Then, with an almost imperceptible, calculated slope, they would guide this precious water for dozens of miles through underground tunnels and open stone channels, all relying solely on the unyielding pull of gravity. The water would emerge in the coastal ports, cool and clear, a constant, reliable flow in the heart of the desert. For a captain arriving from India or East Africa, the sight of these flowing channels was more valuable than any spice. It meant his crew would not just survive but thrive, with a clean, dependable supply that would not sicken them before the next leg of their journey. And just as the water was carefully managed, so too was the fuel. In a land with few forests, firewood became a traded commodity in its own right. Date palm fronds, dried and bundled, and the dense, slow-burning wood of acacia trees were harvested from wadis and sold in bustling port markets. This was not just scavenging, it was a structured economy built around the needs of the sea. The very existence of these oasis ports highlights a profound truth. The global maritime network was not powered by ships alone. It was enabled by ancient water management technologies, a blending of desert survival science with the ambitions of ocean exploration, creating lifelines where logic said none should exist. Yet even the most ingenious oasis was vulnerable to a single, fatal miscalculation. Far out in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, the story of Easter Island stands as a haunting testament to this truth. Known to its Polynesian inhabitants as Rapa Nui, this speck of land was one of the most isolated waystations on Earth, a critical stopover for the great voyaging canoes that navigated by the stars. Its survival depended on a geological quirk, the volcanic craters known as Rono. These massive, bowl-like depressions acted as perfect natural rainwater collectors. The science was one of preservation. The islanders understood that the still, deep water in these craters was susceptible to evaporation and algal growth. They became masters of monitoring the water's quality, knowing that protecting this closed system from contamination was a matter of life and death for the next crew to arrive. This careful management extended to the land. The island was once covered in vast forests of a now extinct giant palm, a tree that provided not only vital timber for repairing hulls and carving new canoes, but also an endless supply of firewood. For centuries, this system worked. The island was a lush, reliable sanctuary, but then the balance broke. The very forests that guaranteed the waystation's function were cut down faster than they could regrow. The trees were used for rollers to move the famous Moai statues, for fuel for building. It was a slow, creeping crisis. As the forests vanished, the entire ecosystem began to unravel. Without tree roots to anchor the soil, erosion polluted the precious crater lakes. Without timber, the islanders could no longer build the ocean-going canoes necessary for fishing or trade, or even to leave. The waystation that had sustained generations of voyagers consumed itself. The story of Easter Island is more than just a mystery of fallen statues. It is the most powerful cautionary tale of the entire network. A waystation could only survive as long as its resources were treated not as an inexhaustible prize, but as a fragile, non-renewable trust. When that trust was broken, the lifeline for an entire ocean simply vanished. The lesson of Easter Island is stark, a reminder that survival is a fragile balance. But on the opposite side of the world, another civilization mastered a balance so delicate it seemed to draw water from the air itself. The skeleton coast of Namibia presents a landscape of pure desolation, a 1,000-mile stretch of baking sand dunes that plunge directly into the frigid Atlantic. To any ship caught in its grasp, it was a death trap. Yet for those who knew its secret, this coast was a waystation. The secret was not in the ground, but in the sky. A relentless, dense fog, known as the Casimbo, rolls inland almost every morning, a direct result of the collision between the cold Bengla current and the hot desert air. Indigenous Sand people, and later the sailors who learned from them, did not dig for water. They wove it from the fog. They erected nets of woven grass or stretched cloths between wooden frames on the dunes. As the fog poured through these simple screens, billions of tiny water droplets would cling to the fibers, coalescing until gravity took over. The droplets would merge, grow heavy, and then trickle down into waiting channels that fed into clay pots or leather bags. This was primitive atmospheric water generation, a brilliant exploitation of a microclimate that turned the air itself into a life-saving reservoir. Every morning, a single well-placed net could yield buckets of fresh, clean water. And just as the water was a gift of the current, so was the firewood. The same Bengla current that created the fog also acted as a massive oceanic conveyor belt, scouring the shores of southern Africa and depositing a continuous supply of driftwood onto the beaches. This wood, bleached white by the sun and salt, was all that fueled the fires of this waystation. It was a system that operated on the very edge of possibility, a testament to a deep, localized genius for observing and harnessing the precise interactions of ocean and atmosphere. There were no forests to manage, no springs to protect. Survival here depended entirely on understanding the invisible rhythms of the wind and the sea, turning a coastal graveyard into a fleeting but reliable harbor. Deep within the Philippine archipelago, a different kind of map guided sailors to survival. This was not a chart of coastlines, but a mental blueprint of a living, breathing geology. The islands are a labyrinth of karst, a landscape where water has sculpted the very limestone into a sponge. Rainwater does not flow in rivers here. It vanishes, seeping deep into a network of caves and underground reservoirs. For a ship arriving from the open ocean, the lush greenery was a promise that water was everywhere, yet finding a single drinkable drop required a specific local key. The location of a freshwater spring might be hidden at the back of a tidal cave, accessible only at low tide. Another might bubble up from a sinkhole, perfectly fresh just a few feet from the saltwater shore. This knowledge was not written down in any ship's log. It was a science of memorization, an oral tradition carried in the minds of local pilots and the chandlers who supplied the ships. These men knew which cave mouth to enter, which rock formation marked a hidden seep, and how the taste of the water changed with the seasons. A wrong turn in this stone maze meant not just thirst, but a confrontation with the cave's other inhabitants, from massive pythons to swarms of bats. This was wayfinding at its most intimate, a partnership between the global ambition of the spice trade and the hyperlocal wisdom of those who knew the land's deepest secrets. And just as the water sources were varied, so too was the fuel. The Philippines' immense biodiversity meant a single island could offer a dozen different types of tropical hardwood. Local communities understood the precise burning properties of each one. Narrow wood burned slow and steady, perfect for overnight heating. Ipple caught quickly, ideal for getting a galley fire roaring. Malave was so dense it was nearly waterproof, making it the best choice for emergency repairs in a damp hold. This was not a matter of grabbing any fallen branch. It was a refined selection process, a botany of fire passed from one generation to the next. The entire resupply operation in the Philippines was a testament to the power of human memory, proving that the most complex networks are sometimes held not in stone or code, but in the living words of a community. Further south, where the world grows cold and the mountains scrape the sky, the waystations of Patagonia offered a different kind of purity. Here, the water did not hide in caves or float on the sea. It roared from the face of ancient glaciers, flowing in milky, turquoise streams that cut through the deep fjords. For ships rounding the treacherous tip of the continent, this was more than just a drink. The water, rich with rock flour and trace minerals ground from the mountains by immense ice, was believed to possess a special power. Sailors who drank from these glacial streams seemed to stave off the dreaded scurvy for longer than those relying on stale casks. They did not understand the science of electrolytes or micronutrients, but their direct experience taught them that this frigid, mineral-laden water was a tonic for the body, a vital boost before facing the fury of the Drake Passage. Securing this resource, however, was a dangerous dance with nature itself. It required a precise understanding of glacial melt patterns, arrived too early in the season, and the streams were frozen solid, locked in winter's grip. Arrived too late after the peak summer melt, and the flows could become a torrential, uncrossable flood or dwindle to a trickle. Captains had to read the landscape like a clock, interpreting the retreat of the snowline and the color of the ice to know the exact window for a safe resupply. And just as the water was a gift of the ice, the firewood was a product of the hard, wind-scoured land. The southern beech forests, known as lenga and koihu, grew slowly in the harsh climate, their wood becoming incredibly dense and resinous. This timber burned with a slow, intense heat that could last through a long, cold night, making it premium fuel for the journey ahead. Every aspect of this waystation, from the timing of the water collection to the selection of the wood, was a science born from perilous observation. It was a testament to human adaptability, proving that even in the most unforgiving environments, a lifeline could be found by learning to read the subtle, powerful language of the ice. 13. The Maldives. Here, the entire concept of an island is redefined. These are not volcanic peaks or limestone cliffs, but rings of living coral, so low they seem to barely break the surface of the Indian Ocean. For a sailor, the sight of a palm-fringed atoll promised land, but it did not promise a drink. There were no mountains to trap rain, no rivers to flow to the sea. Every drop of fresh water on these islands existed in a state of perpetual, delicate suspension. The secret was the freshwater lens. Imagine a vast, invisible bubble of rainwater trapped within the porous coral rock, floating precariously atop the dense saltwater that saturated the island from below. This lens was the atoll's beating heart. Tapping it was a life or death science. Dig a well too shallow, and you would find only a brackish puddle. Dig just a few feet too deep, and your shovel would puncture the bottom of the lens, allowing salt water to surge upward and ruin the entire reservoir for years. The islanders knew the precise depth for each well, a measurement passed down not in inches, but in the taste of the water and the feel of the soil. This was not a task for individuals. It was a community-wide ritual of survival. Everyone understood that protecting the lens from overuse or pollution was a collective responsibility. The science of island hydrology was woven into their daily lives, a shared understanding that their entire existence balanced on that fragile, floating layer of fresh water. And just as the water was a communal trust, so too was the fuel. The coconut palm was the atoll's other lifeblood. While the fruit provided food and milk, the true hidden value was in the husk and the shell. Dried coconut husks burned with a fierce, quick flame, perfect for bringing a pot to a rapid boil. The harder shells provided a longer, slower burn. Every part of the tree was used, creating a closed-loop system where nothing was wasted. The survival of the Maldives as a waystation is a story of profound precision. It demonstrates that the most advanced resupply technology is sometimes not about grand engineering, but about a deep, collective respect for an invisible line, a boundary so fine that a single misstep could turn a paradise into a salt-encrusted prison. 14th, the island of Mauritius. This was a paradise perfected by isolation, a place where giant tortoises roamed and dense, dark forests of ebony stretched from the mountain peaks down to the coast. For European ships pushing further into the Indian Ocean, Mauritius was more than a stopover. It was a sanctuary of almost unimaginable abundance. Deep, clear rivers cascaded from the central highlands, fed by rains that the lush forests themselves helped to summon from the sky. The connection was invisible but absolute. The forest canopy captured moisture from the passing clouds, while the vast, tangled root systems acted as a massive sponge, slowing the rainfall's journey into the earth. This natural regulation prevented devastating floods and, just as crucially, ensured the springs and rivers flowed steadily even in the dry season. It was a perfect self-sustaining water machine. The island's ebony forests provided a second incredible bounty. This wood was so hard, so dense, it sank in water. For ship's carpenters, it was a miracle material, ideal for repairing hulls or replacing splintered masts. As firewood, it burned with a heat so intense and long-lasting that a small load could power a galley stove for weeks. Yet this very perfection made the island vulnerable. The Dutch and later the French established vast plantations, and the sound of axes felling the ancient ebony trees echoed across the slopes, but a remarkable thing happened. Even as the forests were cleared for sugar and settlements, the colonists deliberately preserved patches of untouched woodland, particularly around the headwaters of the most critical rivers and springs. They called these protected areas sacred groves. This was not an act of sentimentality. It was a hard-learned, practical necessity. They observed that where the trees remained, the water ran clean and constant. Where they were stripped away, the springs silted up or vanished completely. This was watershed management in its most intuitive form. They were practicing a primitive but effective science, understanding that the forest was not just a source of timber, but the very engine of the island's freshwater supply. By protecting these groves, they were not just preserving nature, they were safeguarding the island's core function as a waystation, ensuring that every ship bound for the riches of the East Indies could still find the two things it needed to survive: fresh water from the protected slopes and the enduring strength of the ebony tree. But this reliance on hidden lenses and fragile forests reveals a universal truth. A waystation's survival was not just about finding resources, but about finding the right kind of energy. And in the frigid North Atlantic, one island offered a power source so raw it came from the planet's own fiery heart. Iceland was a land of steam and ice, where Viking settlers and the European ships that followed them encountered a world that defied all previous logic. Here, the Earth itself was a partner in survival. The island's intense geothermal activity created vast fields of hot springs, where water, heated deep within the volcanic rock, bubbled to the surface. This was not merely fresh water, it was preheated freshwater, steaming and ready for use. Sailors could mix this scalding water with cold meltwater from nearby glaciers to create a bath or a perfect temperature for drinking, a luxury unimaginable anywhere else on their journey. But the volcanic landscape offered an even more astonishing gift, one that fundamentally altered the equation of resupply. In areas known as solfatara, sulfurous gases seeping from vents would spontaneously ignite, creating eternal, dancing flames that needed no wood to sustain them. A crew could simply place a cooking pot directly over one of these natural fires, boiling their water and cooking their food without ever having to chop a single log. This was a waystation that ran on the planet's own internal furnace, a direct tap into geothermal energy that eliminated the single greatest logistical burden of a long voyage. This direct leverage of volcanic power made Iceland a unique and utterly irreplaceable node in the northern network. It demonstrated that the most successful waystations were not just passive suppliers of resources. They were active collaborators with the local environment, harnessing not just the materials, but the very forces of the earth to sustain human ambition. While Iceland harnessed the planet's internal fire, an ancient civilization on the sun-drenched coasts of the Mediterranean mastered a different kind of power, the power of collection. The Phoenicians did not just find waystations, they built them from the ground up, creating entire cistern cities like Carthage that could sustain vast fleets in lands where nature offered little. Their genius lay in turning the sky itself into a reservoir. In regions where rivers were seasonal and springs were scarce, rainwater was the only lifeline. So they engineered landscapes to capture every drop. Vast, paved courtyards and carefully sloped plazas were not just for public gatherings. They were massive collection surfaces, funneling rainfall into a hidden network of channels. This water would flow into monumental underground cisterns, some large enough to hold millions of liters. The secret to these structures was a revolutionary material, hydraulic cement. This was not ordinary mortar. By mixing lime with volcanic ash, the Phoenicians created a concrete that could actually set and harden underwater, forming a seamless, waterproof seal that prevented their precious stores from seeping back into the thirsty earth. This was civil engineering on a colossal scale, a deliberate, human-made hydrology designed to defy an arid climate. And just as they engineered their water supply, they cultivated their fuel source with the same long-term vision. Far to the east, in the mountain ranges of Lebanon, grew the legendary cedar forests. This wood was the gold standard of the ancient world. Cedar was straight-grained, strong, and naturally resistant to rot and insects, making it the premier material for building the finest ships. But its value did not end at the shipyard. Cedar wood was also a superior fuel, burning hot and clean with a fragrant smoke. The trade in these mighty logs was the backbone of the Phoenician network. Ships would travel from cistern cities like Carthage, loaded with goods, to the Lebanese coast, where they would exchange them for this priceless timber. They would then use that very timber to repair their vessels and fuel their galleys for the return journey. The entire system was a closed loop of sustenance. The cistern cities provided the water that enabled the voyages, and the voyages secured the wood that powered the ships that served the cities. This was not a scattered collection of remote islands. It was a manufactured, managed empire of resupply, proving that the most enduring waystations were sometimes not found, but forged by human ambition and a deep understanding of material science. 17. The Frisian Islands. Here, the ocean itself dictated the rhythm of survival. Stretched along the coasts of the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, this low-lying archipelago was a world of mud, marsh, and relentless tides. For ships navigating the treacherous North Sea, these islands offered a unique and vital currency, peat. This was not firewood in the traditional sense. It was ancient, compacted vegetation dug from the waterlogged bogs that dominated the landscape. When cut into bricks and dried, peat became a slow-burning, smoldering fuel. It did not produce the roaring flames of a forest fire, but its great virtue was endurance. A well-stoked peat fire in a ship's galley could burn for hours with little attention, providing a constant, reliable heat for cooking and warmth during long, foggy nights at sea. But this fuel came with a catch. The very bogs that provided the peat also held the island's freshwater, suspended in delicate lenses just like in the Maldives. Sailors had to dig shallow, carefully positioned wells to tap this layer, knowing that a misjudged depth would mean a mouthful of salt. The true mastery, however, lay not in the digging, but in the approach. The entire operation was a race against the clock, governed by the most precise tidal science. Vast tidal flats, known as wadden, lay exposed for only a few hours between high and low tide. A ship's captain had to calculate his arrival to the minute, navigating through a maze of newly revealed channels to get his smaller boats close to the resource-rich bogs. His crew would then have a narrow window to frantically harvest the peat and fill their water casks before the sea came rushing back across the mudflats, cutting off their escape and potentially stranding them for 12 hours or more. This was waystation science refined to its most elemental form. It was not enough to know where the peat and water were. You had to understand the gravitational pull of the moon on the local waters, to read the subtle signs in the wet sand that indicated a safe path. A single miscalculation could turn a resupply mission into a disaster. The Frisian Islands did not offer abundance. They offered a lesson in timing, proving that in some parts of the world, the most critical resource was not water or wood, but knowledge of the tide itself. 18. The volcanic islands of Java. While other waystations relied on what the land passively provided, here, ancient engineers took a far more active role, building a living, breathing water network from a single, remarkable plant. They looked at the towering bamboo forests covering the mountainous interior and saw not just trees, but a ready-made plumbing system. Bamboo's natural structure was a gift of evolution, a series of long, hollow, waterproof chambers perfectly designed to channel liquid. The challenge was one of gravity and distance. To bring water from the highland springs down to the coastal harbors, they had to construct pipelines that could span miles of rugged jungle terrain. They would fell the largest, most mature bamboo stalks, carefully knock out the internal nodes that segmented the tubes, and then seamlessly join them together, creating continuous aqueducts that snaked through the canopy. This was not a haphazard process. It required a deep understanding of hydraulics, of calculating the precise, gentle slope needed to maintain a steady flow without the pipes bursting from pressure. A miscalculation of just a few degrees over a long distance could mean the water would either stagnate or rush forth with destructive force. These bamboo pipelines were a masterpiece of appropriate technology, turning a biological form into critical infrastructure that could quench the thirst of an entire fleet. And just as the bamboo carried the water, it also provided the fire. The very same plant was a perfect, self-replenishing fuel source. Sections of bamboo, when tossed into a galley fire, would burn with a fierce, popping intensity, the trapped air inside the chambers creating a natural bellows effect. Its greatest advantage, however, was its speed of regeneration. While a forest of oak might take a century to regrow, a bamboo grove could be harvested again in just a few short years, making it one of the most sustainable resources in the entire maritime world. This system represents a pinnacle of integration. It was a waystation that did not merely exist within its environment, but was literally woven from it, demonstrating that the most enduring infrastructure sometimes grows from the ground itself, waiting for a clever mind to connect it. But the most ingenious waystations were not always found on land. For Arabian and Indian traders navigating the relentless sun of the Indian Ocean, the solution to thirst was not a hidden spring, but a clever manipulation of the very sea around them. Their dhows, the graceful sailing vessels of the region, became floating laboratories for one of humanity's oldest chemical experiments, desalination. The process was a masterpiece of simple physics. A large metal pot filled with seawater would be placed over a blazing fire in the ship's galley. As the water boiled, the salt was left behind and the pure steam would rise. Directly above this pot, they suspended a second, cooler container, often a simple copper bowl. When the hot steam hit this cold surface, it would condense back into liquid, dripping down as perfectly fresh, drinkable water. This was distillation in its most elemental form, turning the undrinkable ocean into a life-saving resource. Yet this technological leap came with a steep price. The process was incredibly energy-intensive, requiring a constant, roaring fire to produce even a few liters of fresh water. This made the dhow's supply of firewood not just a convenience, but the absolute key to its survival. Every piece of timber, every bundle of dried palm fronds, was now measured in liters of potential freshwater. A ship that ran out of fuel was not just cold and unable to cook, it was doomed to die of thirst while surrounded by 1 million cubic miles of water. This early science of desalination represents a critical pivot in the story of waystations. it was no longer just about finding what nature provided. It was about using fire and metal to command it, to force the sea to yield its secret. The success of a voyage now hinged on a delicate equation, balancing the weight of stored firewood against the volume of water it could create. This was the birth of a new kind of maritime survival, one where human ingenuity began to build its own lifelines, one precious distilled drop at a time. The Swahili coast transformed the seasonal downpour into a permanent lifeline. Here, in city-states like Kilwa and Zanzibar, the rhythm of trade was dictated by the monsoon winds, and survival meant capturing the sky's bounty. The solution was a masterpiece of urban planning, the communal water silo. These were not simple wells. Builders quarried the local coral rag, a porous limestone, and constructed massive, domed reservoirs that could hold hundreds of thousands of liters of rainwater collected from rooftops and paved courtyards. But the true genius was not in the construction, it was in the management. How do you ensure a limited supply of water lasts an entire dry season for a bustling port of thousands, plus the crews of a dozen visiting ships? The answer was a complex system of water rights and distribution, a social science as vital as the engineering itself. Access to the silos was carefully regulated, with priority given to ships preparing for the next monsoon voyage. The amount a captain could draw was measured and recorded, a precious allocation for the open ocean. This was a community that understood its survival depended on collective responsibility, on treating water not as a personal possession, but as a shared trust that powered the entire Indian Ocean economy. And just as the water was carefully managed, so too was the fuel that boiled it. The coast's dense mangrove forests provided the perfect firewood, a resource so valuable it became a traded commodity in its own right. Dhows would arrive laden with goods and leave with their holds packed with bundles of this dense, salt-saturated wood, prized for its slow, hot burn. The entire system, from the coral silo to the traded mangrove log, was a seamless integration of architecture, social contract, and botany. It proved that the most resilient waystations were not just remote outposts, but sophisticated urban centers where the science of resource management was woven directly into the fabric of city life. High in the Lebanese mountains, far from the cedar forests and the bustling coast, another kind of treasure was being harvested. While the summer sun beat down on the ports below, workers carved deep, insulated pits into the cool slopes. These were not for grain or oil, but for snow. The science was one of preservation against the seasons themselves. They would pack the winter snowfall tight, layer upon layer, separated by straw and sealed with a thick cap of earth. This was not a simple hole in the ground. It was a thermal battery designed with a profound understanding of insulation. The straw created countless tiny air pockets, trapping the cold and dramatically slowing the transfer of heat from the surrounding earth. The earthen cap acted as a final, heavy blanket, shielding the precious cache from the summer sun. The goal was not to keep the snow frozen solid for months, but to manage its melt so slowly that a steady supply of chilled, fresh water could be drawn all the way through the hottest part of the year. This was the secret supply line for the coastal waystations. Caravans of mules traveling in the cool of the night would transport this compacted snow and ice down the mountain trails to the ports. For a ship's captain, this was a luxury that transcended mere thirst. A block of this mountain snow placed in a water cask would chill the contents, making stale water palatable again. More importantly, it could be used in a specially insulated locker to preserve fish, meat, or even delicate fruits for the first critical weeks of a voyage, staving off spoilage and disease. This entire operation turned a fleeting winter event into a permanent, year-round commodity. It was a perfect fusion of highland knowledge and maritime need, proving that the most advanced waystation science sometimes involved looking not out to sea, but up into the mountains. But even the most carefully managed timber forests could not compete with nature's own delivery system. The Amazon River did not wait for ships to come to it. It sent its resources out to meet them. Far from any coast, sailors would encounter a floating forest, a sprawling maze of tangled logs and uprooted trees carried thousands of miles by the mighty current. This was not a place you could find on any fixed map. It was a waystation in constant motion, defined entirely by the river's pulse. For a ship low on fuel, this driftwood was a godsend. Crews in small boats would navigate the treacherous, shifting mass, using grappling hooks to pull aboard logs of ironwood and cedar, timber already seasoned by the sun and the river. This wood was their firewood, the fuel that would boil their water and cook their meals for the next leg of their journey. Yet this bounty came with a hidden danger. The same logs that provided salvation could also spell disaster. A submerged trunk, a so-called deadhead, could lurk just below the surface, invisible to the lookout, capable of staving in a ship's hull with the force of a cannonball. Harvesting this resource was a calculated risk, a test of nerve and seamanship, and the river offered a second, even more fleeting treasure. The Amazon discharges so much fresh water that it creates a vast, discernible layer atop the saltwater of the Atlantic, a phenomenon known as a freshwater lens that can extend dozens of miles out to sea. Sailors learned to read the color and texture of the sea itself. They would lower their buckets carefully, skimming from the surface before the waters fully mixed. This was not a simple task. It required knowing how far out the lens held and how deep you could dip before drawing up a mouthful of salt. A single misjudgment could contaminate an entire cask. The Amazon waystation was the ultimate lesson in impermanence. It taught sailors that a lifeline could be a moving target, a gift that required you to understand not just a fixed location, but the behavior of a continent-spanning river as it met the open ocean. These ancient shell mounds were far more than just garbage dumps. For generations, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest deliberately deposited countless clam and oyster shells at specific, strategic locations near seeps and springs. This was a long-term scientific process in action. The calcium carbonate in the shells, which is essentially a natural antacid, slowly leached into the surrounding soil. This neutralized the natural acidity of the groundwater as it filtered through the earth. The result was a purer, cleaner, and better-tasting water source than the surrounding land could have provided on its own. These midden wells became curated oases of fresh water, engineered over centuries, and towering above these carefully managed water sources stood the region's other great gift, the immense coastal forest. Cedar and fir trees grew in such abundance that they seemed infinite. This wood was a shipwright's dream. The straight, tall trunks of fir were perfect for replacing masts and spars, while the rot-resistant cedar was ideal for patching hulls and providing long-lasting firewood. When European explorers finally arrived, they stumbled upon what appeared to be perfectly placed waystations, complete with pure water and endless timber. But this was no accident of nature. They were benefiting from a deeply rooted, localized science they did not yet understand. The midden wells were a testament to a philosophy that viewed resource management as a long-term partnership with the land, a legacy of clean water and plenty left by a civilization that knew how to listen to the earth itself. The whaling ships of the 19th century created a new kind of waystation, one built not on sustainability, but on industrial extraction. In the frigid, wind-swept waters of the Southern Ocean, remote outposts like South Georgia Island became brutal, self-fueling factories. The entire operation revolved around the try-works, massive iron pots set into brick furnaces on the shore. Here, the blubber of slaughtered whales was boiled down into precious oil. This process created a grim, closed-loop energy system. The initial fire was lit using the last of the ship's imported wood or coal, but once it caught, the ship's crew would feed the flames with the crispy, leftover scraps of rendered blubber itself. The very animal they hunted became the fuel that powered its own disassembly, a dark, efficient cycle that required no external timber supply. This was a waystation that consumed its own reason for existing. And just as they engineered their fuel, they mastered a starkly simple water supply. The islands were surrounded by a floating resource, freshwater icebergs calved from Antarctic glaciers. Crews would use steam winches powered by the same blubber fires to haul colossal chunks of this ancient ice onto the shore. They would then blast it with steam from their boilers, fracturing the ice into manageable pieces that could be melted in vast tanks. This was water procurement stripped of all subtlety, a brute force method that stood in stark contrast to the delicate freshwater lenses of the Maldives or the fog nets of the Skeleton Coast. These whaling stations represent the final, logical extreme of the waystation concept. They were not places of partnership with the environment, but of domination over it. The science was no longer about listening to the land, but about bending it to a single industrial purpose, a purpose that would ultimately consume itself and leave behind only rusting relics on a lonely shore. This hidden science of place was the silent engine of every voyage. From the geothermal vents of Iceland to the floating forests of the Amazon, a universal principle connected every successful waystation. Each one was a masterclass in applied geography, a perfect alignment of location and logistics. The founders did not simply stumble upon these spots. They identified them through a deep reading of the landscape, seeking the precise confluence where reliable freshwater intersected with an accessible supply of fuel. This was the fundamental equation for maritime survival, a non-negotiable requirement written not in a book, but in the very rocks, trees, and climate of a place. But finding this sweet spot was only the first step. The true genius was in the operation, a continuous, living science. It demanded a meticulous understanding of seasonal patterns. When did the monsoon rains fill the cisterns of Zanzibar? When was the glacial melt in Patagonia at its peak, yet not yet a torrential flood? When did the fog roll most densely onto the Skeleton Coast? This was a calendar written in the language of the earth itself. Sustainable harvesting was the next critical rule. Whether it was the communal laws protecting the sacred groves of Mauritius or the precise instructions for tapping a mangrove root in the Sundarbans, every culture understood that to take too much was to break the lifeline for everyone who followed. This was not an abstract environmentalism. It was a practical, hard-won realization that the resource was finite. Finally, the most complex waystations required sophisticated social organization. The water rights system of the Swahili coast silos, the communal digging of wells in the Maldives, the coordinated tidal harvests on the Frisian Islands, all of these were forms of social technology. They were agreements, rules, and responsibilities that allowed a scarce resource to be shared fairly among a transient, hungry population. This entire global network, spanning centuries and cultures, was not built on random luck. It was a distributed, evolving body of knowledge, a profound and practical environmental science that literally powered humanity's expansion across the globe. From the sacred springs of St. Helena to the fog nets of Namibia, these 24 forgotten waystations were the vital arteries of our maritime history. They whisper a truth we often overlook, that exploration was never just a story of courage and ships. It was a story of profound, intimate knowledge, a deep understanding of our planet's hidden resources. The ancient science of resupply, of coaxing fresh water from a limestone sponge or fire from a volcanic vent, stands as a powerful testament to human ingenuity. It reveals a forgotten partnership, a time when our survival was inextricably linked to our ability to listen to and learn from the natural world. As we navigate our own modern challenges of resource management and environmental change, these abandoned hubs offer timeless lessons. They teach us about sustainable harvesting, about community stewardship, and about the brilliant art of adaptation. The silent, moss-covered cisterns and the overgrown paths to forgotten springs are more than just relics. They are blueprints for resilience, left for us by the sailors and settlers who understood that the greatest treasure was not gold, but the knowledge of how to sustain life itself. If this journey into the hidden science of the past has enlightened you, please subscribe for more explorations of our forgotten world. And we would love to hear which of these waystations captured your imagination the most, so share your thoughts in the comments below.